In this video, video 11, we'll describe the cardiac cycle with reference to the actions of the valves in the heart. So I should note that the cardiac cycle is the sequence of events in one heartbeat. Now this very simplified diagram shows a cardiac cycle with three stages: ventricular systole, diastole and atrial systole. Now, as it's a cycle, there's no start and end point, but we can start at the blood filling phase, where the heart fills with blood, and we'll call that the diastole. Now in this phase, both the atria at the top and the ventricles at the bottom relax. And as the muscles relax, it means that the amount of volume in the heart increases because the muscles are not contracting to close the heart off, and therefore there's more space to be filled. So there's a pressure drop in the heart, and the low pressure in the heart means that the blood tends to come from the major veins, and the blood flows into the atria first, and then through the open atrioventricular valves into the ventricles. Now the valves tend to work by opening because there's a lower pressure in the ventricles than there is the atrium, and a lower pressure in the atrium than there is in the veins. So due to the fact that there's a lower pressure here, blood is pushed from the atria to the ventricles, pushing past those valves. So the diastole is simply when the heart or the atria and ventricles are relaxing, which allows blood to fill both the atria and the ventricles. Now the next stage of the cardiac cycle is called the atrial systole. So in this stage, the atria contract, and that small pressure difference, the higher pressure in the atria, the lower pressure in the ventricles, forces even more blood through the atrioventricular valves into the ventricles. And what happens is, this pushes against the outside of the ventricular wall, and it stretches it to allow even more blood to be packed in to those ventricles to ensure there's a full amount of blood there. Now eventually, the pressure inside the ventricles exceeds the atria, and blood attempts to flow backwards. But as this happens, the blood flows into the pockets near the valves, and that causes the valves to snap shut. So that increase in pressure in the ventricles causes the atrioventricular valves to eventually close once the ventricles are full of blood. So that atrial contraction, or atrial systole, causes ventricles to fill with blood. Now the next stage is the ventricular systole, and during this, before this contraction happens, all four valves are closed. The atrioventricular valves close to prevent backflow, and the valves in the aorta and so on, the semilunar valves, are also closed, and this increases pressure. And then what happens is the ventricles start to contract simultaneously. They both contract very strongly, and by this stage the blood can't go anywhere because it can't go through back to the atrium because of the valves are closed, and it can't really flow out of the heart straight away because the semilunar valves are also closed. So the pressure builds up, and when the pressure exceeds the pressure in the main veins, then what happens is suddenly the semilunar valves open up, and it shoots blood or spurts blood on a very high pressure out of the heart. Now this diagram from the textbook shows you quite clearly how the atrioventricular valves work, as we explained earlier, but in more detail. So there are two diagrams: first of all when the valve is open, and second of all when the valve is closed. Now quite clearly we see the atria at the top, the ventricle at the bottom, and the valve opens when the atria contracts, and that increases pressure at the top, decreases at the bottom, and forces blood through to push against the valve. And of course this opens the valve up and allows blood to flow through. But you see it's basically a one-way door due to the shape of the valve and the way that it's connected to the muscle in the ventricle wall. This stops the valves from moving in a direction that allows blood to go backwards. Now, when the valve closes, this is what happens. There's a low pressure in the atria because they've relaxed. If the ventricles contract, or even if blood is increased in the ventricles, the blood pushes under high pressure against the pocket of the valve, and this forces the valve backwards to close the valves, and that means that the blood can't flow into the atrium. So that's because of the increased pressure in the ventricles and the decreased pressure in the atrium which means blood tries to flow backwards, but by doing so, it pushes against the valve pocket and therefore closes the valve up. So this basically keeps the blood flowing in one direction. It keeps the blood going from atria to ventricle and not backwards, and therefore it increases the efficiency of the pump of the heart and prevents backflow of blood, which could be dangerous or even life-threatening. So you should be able to explain, or describe at least, the cardiac cycle by breaking it down to 3 steps, which would be diastole, where the atrium and the ventricles are both relaxed, atrial systole, where the atrium contract to push blood to the ventricles, and ventricular systole, where where the ventricles contract to push blood out of the heart by the veins. And we should remember that at those 3 stages the valves do different things, and they open or close depending on the pressure in the areas the valves are placed in. And the point of the valves is to prevent backflow. And you should really understand and explain how the valves operate based on this video. I would advise you to look at an animation online of a heartbeat, so you can see in 3D or 2D at least the way in which the heart beats and the way in which the valves interact. I would also advise you to remember that systole is the period of contraction and diastole is the period of relaxation in the heart, because it will come up again later in another topic.